So hello everyone, I am Mariah Parsons. I'm your host of Learn to Listen. I wanted to take a second to kind of update you all because I've been doing a lot of thinking about this podcast. Luckily, my work is so awesome that it gives me the time with a 4-day work week to really reflect and strategize. And I've been getting a lot of momentum around the podcast. So thank you for everyone who's been listening. It is honestly so fun for me just to kind of fill my days and be intentional about talking to people and making sure that I'm kind of doing my part to learn about other people, learn about people in my life, but also to kind of encourage an audience or encourage listeners, encourage other people, family and friends to do the same. So with all that momentum, I definitely wanted to take a second to kind of pause and just update you all about what I've been thinking about, because I want to grow and evolve the show with everything that I'm learning about the podcasting world. So I know a little while ago, I kind of switched the look and the feel of the podcast a bit. But now I'm going to do that again. And I think there's going to be a lot of iterations. So I hope you'll have patience with me going forward. But I'm going to be giving perhaps more of a reflective episode intros. In the past, I've kind of just been summarizing what we talk about. And I think I want to do this because I really think that there's a ton of things that when I'm listening back to the episode, I'm like, oh my gosh, I wish I would have said that. So I'm going to use this intro, maybe even in the outro sometimes, to just kind of talk about my reflections before or after, I listen to the podcast and in the post-production. I'm also going to start, each episode with one of my favorite clips from the episode. I feel like that's just something fun to do. It'll also just be fun to splash those over social. Which, speaking of that, I am going to be growing more of our social media channels. So Instagram right now, please go follow. It's Learn to Listen Podcast. If you don't already follow, subscribe, of course, on your wherever you're listening to this, whatever audio streaming service you use. And then I'm starting to grow out our Facebook, our Twitter, our LinkedIn, our YouTube channels. And it's really fun for me. I've really loved kind of social media content creation. So, I mean, of course, I would absolutely love if all of you would go follow those channels, or even if it's just your favorite one, to stay up to date, all things Learn to Listen. Other than that, though, I feel like I'm really flourishing in my life right now, and I want to have why I'm kind of speaking and just, anything that comes to mind and why I want to do that is because I feel like I am flourishing in almost every aspect of my life. I mean, of course, there's still things that I'm working on and trying to improve or I'm not happy with, but I'm willing to give myself grace that is part of the life process. But I want some of the episodes to really reflect my internal monologues or thoughts that perhaps don't come up in conversations, or like I said, wish I would have shared before. So with that, here's a clip of my favorite part of the episode with Alex Oleson.
This is when I want to settle down and have a family or anything. But when you're actually in the process of it, it definitely it changes where your priorities are. That's not saying I don't still want to have a huge impact, but it's also for a different reason. I want my son to see that so that he understands the world in the same way that I do, in the same way that he has gifts that he can give to his community and that his community can benefit and he can make other people better. So it's just kind of been a reorientation of what I see as success.
So that is a little clip. It'll play. Hopefully y'all will listen and find out where it is in the whole episode. But I chose this because, I mean, honestly, I'm just so excited for Alex. And now that we're posting this episode a little bit later, his son has been born, a beautiful baby boy. And I chose this clip because I think it's such an awesome perspective of just how your priorities can shift. And I am not in the same life stage that Alex is in right now, but at the same time I am, age-wise, experience-wise, in the professional world, very similar. But then his personal life right now is just flourishing with all these new exciting journeys and experiences that he's going to have. So that was my favorite clip, of just hearing how great of a father he already is, because he has done serious reflection about what he wants, what it means to be a father, and the impact that you can have on your kids and in your community. So that was my favorite clip. I mean, there's so many to choose from. It was so difficult, and I had like 3 lined up, but I ultimately went with this one because I think it's so sweet and so endearing, and it really just kind of highlights the person that I've gotten to know over, the past couple of months of Alex just being like a stellar person all around, but father, friend, athlete, I mean, worker, leader. So just like everything. And over the episode, we relate over our hometowns, which is just so funny. I mean, that's such a strong part of my identity. So I'll always talk about it. Just like growing up in a small town, knowing a lot of people, having a stable, supportive home and environment to grow up in. I mean, I'll till to my grave, be so thankful for that. Also, what I wanted to touch upon is just like we are walking through identity. I mean, there's one part in the episode where Alex kind of like asks me, and it was fun. Like, as a host, I feel like I'm usually asking most of the questions, but it was really interesting. And I loved when he kind of asked me if I related to him, like with his identity struggle with his journey of finding himself and understanding all the different parts that make up his identity. And so I thought it was really interesting. And I think you can definitely hear me, like, as he asks me that question, I take my time in thinking through what I want to say and how to process, because I definitely wanted to make sure, like, my thoughts, that I was doing them justice in, like, yes, I was the emotional roller coaster or the emotional development that happens as a kid, like I related to, but as far as the reasoning behind why I kind of, or how I learned about my identity was, so different. And so I was debating if I should like take out these pauses and, like, of course I get nervous. I'm like, oh, am I gonna sound like dumb or like I don't know what I'm talking about? But I purposefully left them in there, both as an exercise for me. Just listening back to my own voice, I was like, oh my God. But I intentionally left those pauses in there because I wanted to make sure that I was giving the right energy and telling my story in the way that I wanted to be told. So I ask that you have patience while I'm kind of like working through all those different emotions. And then, like, honestly, one of the other great things that stuck out to me on this podcast was just like learning about both of us kind of being nervous to launch a podcast. And I mean, Alex sat on his for a little while, and then he kind of said, like, I just, at some point you just have to publish. And that's kind of all those emotions that I've been going through recently. Since launching my podcast, I was just like, you know what? What's so fun about it is it feels like a conversation. Like when I'm listening to my favorite podcast, it feels like a conversation where you don't really have to add anything, but it makes you think the same way as if you're right there in that conversation. So you don't really need, a high social battery to be listening to podcasts. And so, it was just fun to hear him kind of talk about like launching his own podcast, me relating. It brought me back to, senior year of college when I launched mine. Also just fun, like Spokes folks, to hear him ideate why he chose that name. So with that, please go listen, and I hope you enjoy this full episode with Alex Oleson. Remember to follow on social media channels and make sure to subscribe on your listening platform. So welcome to Learn to Listen. Today we are joined by Alex, and he is the founder and host of his own podcast, Spokes Folks. So thank you, Alex, for being here. We're joined and we met through the OR Fellowship, which is the program that we are both currently in. I'm so excited to have you and so excited to learn more. It's been great getting to know you over the past couple months. So welcome, Alex.
Thanks, Mariah. I am so excited to be on here today.
So excited. When I was waking up this morning, I was like, yes, I finally get to talk to Alex on the podcast. I'm so excited. And first I thought it would be fun to have you give an intro, like where you're from, kind of what brought you to Indianapolis, what you're doing right now, just like your whole life story. Let's dive in.
Yeah, I'll do a quick little timeline across I-70, because that's basically where my life has gravitated around. I was born in Kansas City on the Missouri side. I was born in Kansas City, Missouri, and actually, when I was 2 months old, I was put in the foster care system. So was then adopted onto the Kansas side because my mother was in a homeless shelter on the Kansas side. So um, that's kind of why I moved over to Kansas and was put into the Kansas foster care system. And then basically grew up, born and raised, well, I guess not born, but raised in Lenexa, Kansas, right outside of Kansas City, a really great suburb, a lot of opportunities, a lot of privileges that I don't know if I would have received if I wasn't, did not grow up in that area. And then
What privileges were those? I'm curious.
just great schools,
Yeah, okay.
tremendous schools. The Kansas City actual public schools they were non-accredited. They were unaccredited for several years when we were in high school and middle school. So going living in Johnson County, which there's a lot of jokes about Johnson County JoCo moms and stuff like this, because it's like very much like just there's a lot of privilege, there's a lot of resources, there's a lot of nice homes, there's a large tax basis for good homes, good education, a lot of access to um, healthy, clean foods, additional help if you're not, um, you know, just additional resources like summer schools, summer camps, all those things
Mhm.
that really
Right.
contribute to a positive child development. There's also a lot of things that can go along with that are difficult, and a lot of those things kind of impact the reason I started my podcast. But we'll get to that later. Um, Kind of grew up, went to great public schools all my life, and moved over to St. Louis and for college. So I really wanted to go to St. Louis University for really the sole fact that I was accepted into their Martin Luther King scholarship program going into or in the middle of my senior year. And at that time, I'd always played basketball, and I had a couple offers to play basketball. I was talking to a couple of Division II schools, but a lot of NAIA schools, which are kind of D3 level, but you can
Yeah.
get like scholarship. So I had multiple offers from those size schools, and really always knew I had been to a large high school and knew I wanted to continue going to a large school because I just love meeting people. I was student body president and just knew I wanted more experiences that could expand my understanding and just who I knew and what my potential was. And went to went for MLK Day and just was really impressed by the Jesuit impact that the university believed they had on the community, and was just very just knew that's kind of the area I wanted to work in when I got older, is just community and empowering other people and giving people resources that don't have them. And so I was just really impressed and went for the interview. One of my older brothers took me to St. Louis one weekend. And when I got the call back that I had gotten the scholarship, I called that night. I called all the college coaches that had given me offers and just said, I think I'm going to be going to St. Louis University. And at that time, it was still up in the air whether I was going to try and walk on to the basketball team there. I had a contact from high school his dad actually knew the head coach, so was talking about maybe doing a preferred walk-on spot. But I actually did track my senior year to stay in shape during all of that, and was ranked second in the state in 6A going into state, and then hurt my ankle warming up. Just like rolled it jumping onto the mat and ended up getting fourth, I believe. So within all that, one of my coaches, he actually went to my church. He reached out to the SLU coaches without me knowing, and they got back to me, asked me to walk on my freshman year, and then broke the school record my first year, or
Dang.
my first meet, and then ended up getting scholarship the following year. So I ended up, um, getting to compete in Division I sports for 4 years, and still in the school record holder, and won conference. And yeah, it was a really fun ride. And
Mm.
now I'm in Indy. I've moved a little bit farther east on I-70, And uh, yeah, it's really cool. It's very interesting. I studied political science, minored in economics and urban poverty studies. So I'm really interested in the way that systems build cities. And it's very interesting to see the parallels between Kansas City and Indianapolis and how they feel compared to St. Louis. They have a similar dynamic in the way that they're built. And one of the big reasons for that is just when you think of St. Louis, it's right on you have the arch and it's right on the Mississippi River. And so there's a lot of growth that occurred out from literally what used to be just like river barges coming to a small fort. And it grew out from that. Whereas Kansas City and Indianapolis have more of like a grid square around the central area. So
Right.
yeah, a lot of random stuff, but really just was interested in um, just community building, social entrepreneurship, and social justice, and kind of felt like I could apply some of those things to where I go in my career after. But I definitely know that there's some extent that you need to understand business, fundraising, nonprofits, just all those things. And that's kind of why I decided to join the Orr Fellowship and why I'm in Indy now.
Right. Wow. That's awesome. I love that you can create that image of just moving on I-70. That's phenomenal. And this is too, when you were speaking about your hometown and the privileges that you were raised with, this is why I love talking to people on the podcast, because I came from a very similar town where I had, so many opportunities as a kid. Like I could ride my bike to my friend's house. I wasn't like an inner city, it's a suburb. I knew all the people that I was growing up with. It was super safe. Great public school systems. The people I was around, I mean, they pushed me to grow both personally and professionally. It's funny to say when you're younger, but I guess academically at that point. And so I was going in a high school, like a pretty competitive high school with a bunch of athletes, a bunch of high achieving people, like student body presidents, people who are volunteering in the community, like every day, people from, for the most part, stable homes. And I think it's just so funny how I'm from New Jersey. And so I think I always wonder if, that adolescence and that development and that strength that you have is kind of what led us to a program that speaks to the same, the same merit of just like high achieving individuals who are really going after it, taking upon themselves to be intrinsically motivated. I think that's really cool and fun to hear you speak to.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of truth in that. And if you haven't read the book Outliers is a
Yep.
great book that
Malcolm
talks about
Gladwell.
so much of this. So yeah, shout out Malcolm.
Yeah. Yeah. As if we know him. Yes. Great book. And two, okay, I'm curious, you're going to have to fill me in a little bit about the MLK scholarship program that was at St. Louis, because I am not familiar with it. So what was it that kind of like drew you to that program?
It was really just what the alumni were doing. They were doing,
Mm-hmm.
you see a lot of people breaking barriers right now in the workforce, whether it's women getting into tech or in fields where they haven't traditionally been seen, or to take that even a step further, Black women getting into fields or Black men getting into fields where are in industries where the circles don't necessarily traditionally look like that. And I think they brought in a really cool alumni panel. And I think one of the biggest things that's always pushed me in my life is looking at people that I want to see myself as in the future.
Yeah.
There's always a component of it that's like, I need to also create my own path. And I want hopefully people will look back at me one day and say, if I could follow some of the things, the path that Alex Oleson took, then I could make a better impact on the world, and I could, reach whatever you deem as success. And I think there's a lot of, I guess right now I'm engaged and I'm expecting my first child, and super excited. And I think a lot of that also kind of puts things into perspective, as far as I think a lot of things where a lot of places where I was measuring success prior to was very focused on my career, very focused on, all right, what's the job that's going to have the the coolest sounding name, the most professional sounding name. What's the highest title I can reach?
Yeah.
And now it's much more focused on how do I have a work life balance where I can be in my family's life? How do I balance providing for a family with, being a good partner, being a good parent? And I think a lot of those things, they can be high on somebody's wants, but until it becomes a reality, those things aren't always as high on the thing because you don't have to think about them as much.
Yeah, for
You think
sure.
about, this is when I want to settle down and have a family or anything. But when you're actually in the process of it, it changes where your priorities are. That's not saying I don't still want to have a huge impact, but it's also for a different reason. Like, I want my son to see that so that he understands the world in the same way that I do, in the same way that he has gifts that he can give to his community, and that his community can benefit and he can make other people better. So it's just kind of been a reorientation of what I see as success. And yeah, it's been really exciting and really great to just think about and puzzle over and write about and just try to bring into fruition.
Yeah, I mean that's so powerful just hearing you be introspective about what you want to see and like where you're kind of gauging that success of coming from. And I mean, I am not engaged and do not have a child on the way, so I cannot relate directly, but I'm so happy for you. And you, of course, know this. But just like hearing you talk about the impact that you want to have and having that be before you had to prioritize your family. I think that's so cool of just being at such a like ripe age where you can kind of make that pivot in your career and say, I want to be successful, but now success is defined in a different way. I think that's awesome. And like wanting to have an impact on the community so that your son can see that and like be proud. I think that's so special.
Yeah, and I think a lot of it, to get into more of just my adoption story, I think
Mhm.
there's so many systematic cycles that um, affect the Black community. And I think having a Black son, I want him to have a better experience than I did, because there's a lot of places where you can be privileged and still unprivileged, and you can experience different things that maybe other people don't. And a lot of the work I really wanted to do um, was really about motivating other people to just reach their potential
Mhm.
regardless of those barriers. And that's also why I wanted to create Spokes, is because so many of us have those barriers. We have low points in our lives, but that doesn't mean we should stop working. It doesn't mean we should give up. It means we should work harder. Um, and I want to put that on display for my son now, as well as, you know, the kids back in St. Louis that I worked with that didn't think they could go to college. They didn't think they could go to the universities in their own community because they thought they were for rich white people. And so it's not something you can just say and just tell somebody to that it's achievable, because it is. You have to, really put in the work. And so that's really what motivates me, is putting in the work for other people, to help them, achieve their goals, reach their goals, achieve their dreams, and make a community better. But now it's not just about my neighbors, it's also about my own family, and continually doing that for myself as well.
That's so beautifully said. And I'm curious, so you had said like I'm privileged from other areas we already talked about, are where we grew up, and then not privileged in some areas. And that's an idea that I came into realization actually through Lynn, one of our mutual friends. I know you had her on the podcast, which shout out to Lynn Gary. She's awesome. And you guys kind of chatted a little bit about this and your adoption stories. Um, but she had recently shared like just the notion, I guess, that you could be privileged in some aspects and then privileged in and not privileged in others. And I think hearing that, I just want to echo it because I think like it was something that I might have come across, but it didn't really make an impact in my life of how strongly it is. Like I do have racial privilege and I do have like economic privilege, but then again, like she kind of helped me guide my own identity in that aspect of I don't have privilege because I am a woman. And I think that's just something so special. And so hearing you talk about that, I'm curious, like, when did you kind of come to that like realization? Was it kind of recently, like me with having these conversations with Lynn and like our DEI team through or like through your adoption story and growing up? Or
Yeah, it was definitely something that I always saw, but I didn't always understand. And I grew into it. I would say probably maybe earlier than some people in my some of my friends did, and that created some, like, it created moments of tension and
right.
conflict when I would try and have a difficult conversation that maybe they just didn't understand. um so I was the youngest. I'm the youngest adopted of 11. And so the Olsons, they had 4 kids, and then they decided we had 3 boys and 1 girl, and our daughter wants a sister. So they just
Oh,
decided to maybe adopt a sister, but they had a boy next, another
oh
boy,
my gosh.
and ended up adopting 7 young people from the foster care system.
Wow.
But they fostered over 100 before my dad passed away. And um, within after he passed away, when I was in high school, my mom began to foster again. So it was something that was around me. Like, I just kind of always saw people around me. And I think um, kind of similar to what Lynn was saying, you kind of, as a kid, have this idea of adoption as, your parents loved you so much that but they couldn't take care of you, so they loved you enough to put you um, into give you to a family that could care for you. So that was kind of the story you get when you're really young. But there's a lot of things that go along with that. And Lynn kind of touched on this in her podcast, having being in a mixed family, of having her mom is Asian and her dad is white. So she kind of was able to hang on to some of her culture. But there's a lot of times in the Black community, in the Two Spirit youth community, which is Native American young people in the foster care system, that they can lose some of that culture and that attachment. And so I found myself, even though I was in a great family I knew loved me, I found myself looking around for at these Black women, wondering, are you my mother? Like, because I still knew, like, I always knew I was adopted from a
Yeah.
very young age. And so there's always that. And not to say that's a huge thing to have to deal with, but it is definitely something that I know. I just have had conversations with other young people that have been through the system, and they've had, those similar curiosities as well. So I think that's kind of where it started. As I got older, just being I was in middle school, I was probably 6'2". So being just like
Wow.
a large Black kid is, it can be scary, in today's age. And so I remember being stopped going back into my high school or my middle school, because the officer didn't believe that I was a student. They thought I looked too old, just
Like an
like
adult.
couldn't have
Yeah.
been. Yeah, they thought I was an adult or a high
Hmm.
schooler, and I was going back in to get my phone. So she took me to the office, started asking me all these questions. Like, I'm like, I didn't do anything wrong. So just things where you can still be in a really great school, but that was an example of me having a harder time just getting my cell phone, because I didn't look like the other kids in the school. Like, it wasn't suspected. So then the principal comes out and she says hi to me, and the officer was like, I'm so sorry. Like, took me
Right.
out in the hall, took me back out in the hall, and they're like, oh, who is this? Like, do they go here? And oh yeah, it's Alex Oleson. He's a great student. Blah blah blah. And so then she takes me back out in the hall and is like, I am so sorry. I really didn't think you were a student. I had a high school shirt on, so she thought like I was a high schooler, had graduated or something. I was like, my face looks like a kid. But that was kind of one of the first times. And um just seeing, there's just, I mean, yeah, I think we're all, kids are kids, so kids are going to
Right.
say things. And so just
Hmm.
dealing with some of those racial um issues going up, I think it can still be an unsafe place. In an environment that seems like it can be really safe, it can still be hostile for certain people that look different. So I would
Right.
say that's just kind of some of it that I dealt with growing up. And another reason why I wanted to, like, really, another thing that influenced my podcast and people getting their stories out And I'm happy to go into some of those stories if you'd like. But
Yes, yeah, yeah. I'm gonna hold you off on that because I have a couple more questions that I'd love to hear you speak to, but I do want to hear about those podcast stories, so keep them in mind. But you'd mentioned you're wanting to connect with Black culture. How did you kind of go about reconnecting, or do you still find yourself like still trying to make those connections with in Indianapolis with the people you're meeting? Um, I know too, when I'd mentioned or when I'd listened to your podcast, you had mentioned that you had met your birth mom at 18. So was that kind of like, I guess, was that a pivotal point in growing up where you could reconnect with your culture, or was it something different?
I think there's something to understand about all through adolescence. We all go through it. We all have our own sense of self, and
Mhm.
we kind of develop that as we get older. And this sounds really cheesy, and I didn't say this in my podcast, but I have siblings that are Black as well. So I'm not in like my family looks like very colorful, and it is a great family to be a part of. I have a sister from the DR. I have a brother who's American Indian. I have another brother who's Black. I have a brother who has special needs. So we look like I have other brothers that are Black as well. So just I have we have like a really great diversity in our family. And that being said, like I grew up listening to jazz, reading books of kids that looked like me. I think where the path kind of diverged is when you get into school, when you get into elementary school. And I should have worn this shirt, but Aubrey got me a shirt that says Black history is more than slavery. And I think when you're younger,
Powerful.
when you're in first, second grade, like the only things you really learn about um, African American history is the impact of slavery. And so there's
Yeah.
a lot of you understand, you kind of get the magnitude of it, but you don't actually hear any names. You maybe hear George Washington Carver. Um, you hear a name or two sprinkled in there, but there's so much Black history, there's so much rich culture and history that you just don't get. And so a lot of that was just self education on my own. I always got a book from Christopher Paul Curtis from my parents growing up, whether it was Watson's Go to Birmingham or Bud Not Buddy or Elijah Buxton. And I loved those books. I would immerse myself in them because there was a character I could see myself in. And that was
Yeah.
so powerful to me. And so I think as far as feeling and knowing I was Black, I always knew that. It was just really learning more about, okay, so I'm now exploring Black authors. And as I got older, I kept doing that. But what does it actually look like? What does all this look like in the context of my own family? And where does like my path fit into all this? And so that was really where the understanding and the need and the desire to want to understand came from, is just I'm hearing about all these stories. I'm trying to learn more about it, but where does my actual piece fit into this puzzle
Right.
of
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
of so I playing basketball. I was always around. Like I always had friends that were Black. If that like
Yeah,
I'm like
yeah.
I knew I was Black. I had brothers that were Black. Like so as far as like a cultural thing, I always felt connected to the greater culture, but I wanted to figure out like where my actual what my family history was. I've
Yeah.
always loved history and was obviously a political science major in college. I actually came in double majoring in poli sci and sociology. And so both of those fields are very much about systems and people and decisions. And so it was really easy for me to map that out. But as far as um, just growing into myself, I think just adolescence, you start to notice you're different than other people. You really start to pay attention to those things. And I definitely experienced colorism from even other Black kids that went to my school that were mixed kids or kids that were lighter that were had grown up in this environment. Whereas like I got called dark for a semester, sitting in a class, and I would get told, oh, like we can't sit next to you, dark. So just things that those things hurt, and those
Oh, for
things are
sure. Yeah.
and those things aren't, those things are have been taught to us, like our people, for a long time, because it was the lighter you looked, the closer you were to being white, the more
Yeah.
privilege you got. And so
Right.
those are things that are just unfortunately a part of society that if you haven't been exposed to it, you don't understand. And so it's easy to turn a blind eye to it. But even I have a good friend of mine who played softball with Aubrey, and she talked about it because she's biracial, and her brothers are darker than her, and so just talking about that. And I actually, shout out Sadie, would love to have her on the show as well. So we'll see if maybe if we can get her, and if I can get an interview with her as well. But yeah, I mean, turning it back on you, Mariah, I mean, have you experienced or seen any of these things? Like, did you experience or notice any of those things as a high schooler or a middle schooler? Because it really takes some time to think about, and then witness it, and then think about it, and kind of, I feel like it was like a development thing for me, if that makes sense. And people can't see the gestures I'm making, but it's like stretching like Play-Doh or something. Like something happens, and it kind of grows you and informs, the way you view the world, or the way you view a situation or something. And I think that's like a very key point where that kind of accelerated some of my understanding about my racial identity, my ethnicity, a lot of those things.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's beautiful. Like just hearing you speak about that journey. And I would say, as you asked me, like, had I had a similar experience, I think to the emotions that you had, I think I relate to, in the sense that trying to find yourself and like where you fit in society, that is such a huge part of adolescence and growing up. And that was definitely something I struggled with, not for a racial reason, but more my self-image, I think, if that makes sense, of like, where do I exist to my friends, and like, who am I to them? Who do I want to be and then again, my family as well, our town in general, just like people in my high school outside of my direct friend group. And I think that was something that I definitely struggled with, because growing up, I did kind of feel like I was like the nice girl next door, like didn't have any issues with anyone really. And I think as I get older and I start to dedicate more time to investigating my own identity and like what parts I think are true to me and what parts I think I learned along the way, I think it's kind of a mix of, I sometimes wanted to like blend into the background and not be noticed, so that I wouldn't be like problematic or a burden for anyone, and wouldn't feel like I would give a reason to people to like not like me, because I think that was like something I was so scared of, is like being an outcast. Like when you're young, that is the worst thing, that, like your life is falling apart if you're the outsider, right? And so as I've gotten older and had more discussions about race and identity and ethnicity and sexuality and all of the different parts that can play into your identity, I think that's really where I came in. I became familiar with my privilege of, I didn't have to worry about race growing up, and I didn't have to worry about anything that would alienate me just by looking at me. And I think that was something that I had to kind of acknowledge and work through, of like, where then, because I didn't struggle for my racial identity, where then I could improve and educate myself. So I kind of took it upon myself to then go to conferences through like the NCAA, the ACC, through athletics in college, is where I became most oriented and familiar with like how to express myself, of yes, I cannot relate to someone who is in a racial minority, but I can support them. And I think it's, of course, like if you are white or you come from privilege, you get nervous about talking about anything that comes in DEI, because it is very vulnerable and centric to our identity. But that's also kind of why I started the podcast, of I wanted to push myself to be vulnerable and have these conversations and like really think about what I wanted to say. Yeah. Thank you for our listeners. Alex is snapping. But I think that's like, so as you ask if I had similar, I guess like thought processes, I definitely did, but for different reasons, if that makes sense.
Totally. But I love that. And thank you for being, honest and open and everything about that.
Yeah. And I'm curious too, like one question I wanted to ask you, and please tell me if it is not correct, because I don't have any people in my direct friend groups that have gone through foster care. But my notion, at least from like media or just stories I've heard, is usually it's one child gets adopted by a family. And I think it's kind of unusual to have like multiple kids adopted into the same family. And I think you said you had seven, correct? That seven siblings that were adopted and then four that were not. Is that right?
Yeah.
So
Yeah. So yeah. So I'll just go from there because I think um, there is, unfortunately, there is a, I don't want to call it a pandemic, but um, there is a pattern that happens way too often where siblings are separated.
yeah,
And that can happen for a lot of different reasons. That can happen because um, if just trigger warning, if one child is sexually abused, then that child might be taken out of the home, taken out of the family, whereas another sibling may go to a grandparent's home, or a kin, it's called a kin placement, so somebody else in the family, not in the nuclear family. So there's a lot of different reasons why that can happen. It can be because a CASA or a judge orders it. It can be just because, it can solely be from the fact that one of the kids is a baby. And I was a baby when I went into the system, and it's like easy to get babies placed because so many people want to adopt a baby. Like, I'm 2 months old when I went into the
right.
system. I was adopted when I was 2.5. So it's very easy to, people want a baby that they can like hold and mold. And so if it's like a younger sibling and an older sibling, it's much harder to, unfortunately, there's 120,000 young people who have had their parental rights um, terminated, that are just sitting waiting to be adopted, that could be adopted, and about 20,000 young people that age out of the system each year. So there's a lot of young people, kids, basically teenagers, that are um, did not find a home, and a lot of them, or do not have a legal, stable connection. And many of them have siblings that may not have that same experience if they were younger. There's a lot. I can think of several, foster kids that have been at our home, that the younger one of my younger brothers, James, he got adopted, and his older brother, Robert, didn't get adopted because he was 16 when they were in care, and James was 5.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of scenarios where that happens, and that's one thing that they're trying to change, is keeping families together. Because in the same way that studies show that keeping a child with their kin, whether it's like a grandparent, aunt and uncle, step parent, different parents, it's much easier. There's less. It's much easier for the kid, as far as keeping a child connected with their their family. And it's also just less paper, like less financial stress
Yeah.
on the system. What
Mhm.
it's not, sorry,
Legally,
what
it's
it's
just
not,
easier.
yeah,
Yeah.
but what it's not is less. There's way less resources, unfortunately, because they
Wow.
they figure, oh, they're just keeping with the family. They don't need the same support system as a foster parent does, who's taking in a kid that is not related to them. So there's a lot of work and systemic change and legal advocacy that's going on to get a lot of those changes, get more representation for kin. In my case, there was never a kin placement that was thought about, because my birth they just didn't have any knowledge of any family members. So like there was never even a chance for that. And yeah.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing. Yeah, I appreciate it, because I think from my understanding at least, it is unique, like your situation of having a lot of brothers and sisters who were in foster care. So I wanted to ask that because that was something that came to mind of kind of why is that so unique? So that you just sharing that, it sheds a lot of light on it.
Yeah, and my siblings that were adopted, I don't have any biological relationship to any of them.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it really is just that, yeah, people that the Olsons just wanted to, do their part and
Mhm.
they did it. So,
Great
yeah,
people. Yeah.
yeah,
I'd love to meet them someday. Yeah.
yeah,
Um, I do want to pivot because we've been alluding to our podcast and talking about your podcast a bit. So I thought we could round out the episode with talking about that. I'm curious I have two questions. Where did the name of the show come from? And then how did you like actually go about starting it? Like when did you kind of decide, was this always something that you wanted to do? Because it is on the newer side. So I wanted to kind of put you on the spot and shed some light on
yeah.
it.
So spokes folks, it came to me. I love like creating names, and
Mhm.
normally when I get a name or something that comes to my mind, I just write it down and run and roll with it.
Yeah.
I wrote a speech on Stevie Wonder that I still remember, and I'm not gonna
Oh my
get into
gosh.
that, but it
Recite it
came to
now.
me. It came to me in fifth grade. This happened in fifth grade, and it just clicked in my mind. I wrote it down on a note card, and then won our school's competition for like our Great American speeches. So I got to go to a different school with all this kids in the district and be like our school's advocate for it or spokesperson. But
That doesn't
back to that
surprise me at all.
spokesperson, great transition into the name
Mhm.
spokesperson. So spokes folks, I just really like the word of calling people folks. It can be like a really inclusive term for calling people folks, but also it really came from a lot of the times I was the only Black kid in the room or the only kid that was adopted in the room. And so I was the spokesperson for, it felt like, for all of that conversation. If there
Right.
was any topic of slavery as a kid, or reading an uncomfortable book where they say the N word, I felt like every eye was on me to like kind of get approval. And there's a lot of power
Mhm.
in that. There is a lot of power in that. But this, I really just wanted to create this to, um, because I think there was a lot of privilege I got in that. I
Yeah.
ended up becoming our student body president because I think because people respected what I said and thought I had good things to say, and looked to me for advice, and I brought energy with even those difficult things. So I think there was a lot of ways that I learned to just lean into it, and I think there's a lot of people that do that. Like similar to what you said in your journey for creating your podcast, I think there's a lot of merit in taking things that are uncomfortable and growing from them. And so that's really where the idea came from. And I was having a conversation with um, actually one of the former leadership team members of the Orr Fellowship, and they were just talking about how difficult it can be to get people to come speak from diverse backgrounds on certain topics because they're just so they're like always the person that people want to come speak. And so it's just like always trying to get, oh, this person's a great speaker. This person's a great speaker. Like, let's try and book them here. Let's try and book them here. But there's like probably 10 other people that are trying to get them booked as well to come speak. And so there's kind of like that, there's that dynamic of always being the person people look to when it comes to a certain topic or subject. And I kind of took that back, and I just wanted to help work to eliminate some of that misunderstanding of what people are going through, what they're trying to accomplish, and just to be heard. So, I mean, in some ways, it is a sounding board, but it also, I'm really trying to create a community with it. So I got the idea. I had a conversation. I said, I'm going to make a podcast about this because I can resonate with that. And I created the podcast officially on October 24th
Mhm.
of last year. And I sat with my what and why episode record. Like I dropped it 2 weeks ago. So September or January 12th or something, let's just say. So I sat on it for probably 3 months, just not having the
Right.
courage to drop it thinking, what are people going to think it's dumb? Are people not going
Mm-hmm.
to listen
Yeah.
to it? Is it going to be worth it? And I really debated, am I just doing this for myself? Is this part of my healing journey? To just, record these episodes with people, with foster care advocates, with immigrants, with artists and musicians. And I really thought to myself, like, is this for me, to give me some sort of purpose and like where I feel like my talents lay, or is this something that I really want to share? And it's been really cool. I've had, I think, over 100 listens in like the first week, so it's been pretty cool to get some traction, and it definitely feels like a victory. And I've gotten so many texts from people who love it, and it's also just creating community from people that are part of the Spoke Folk community. So Mariah, you're a Spoke Folk now, like you're part
Yeah.
of
Oh
the
yeah. I'm in the
community.
community.
And it's just really cool to like Lynn and Josh connected after listening to each other's episodes, because like they just like loved each other's episodes. So just creating even that community of hosts of people that are not afraid to share their stories. And it's cool, and it's already gaining traction. And just I don't know, I couldn't have asked for anything better. I couldn't have imagined it going the way it's going.
Right. Yeah, no, I really relate to that excitement around when you launch a podcast. And I had this is one of my other questions that I wanted to ask. So you read right into it, but like the excitement of like dropping it, but kind of the nerves that go along with having a podcast.
Yeah.
And it's like a imposter syndrome a little bit. I'm like, who am I? Like, I don't have anything that people want to hear about. So I launched my podcast last September. And I just remember like, I was like, I kind of just had to say like, you know what, whatever, like, I'm just doing it. I'm going for it. And I remember like that thrill of just people texting you, like being so supportive, and it really means so much. And just like having people be in your community, be in your corner, it feels so great. So I wanted to share, I'm definitely in your corner, and I encourage everything you are doing. I think it's so awesome too, to hear about adoption and have that centric piece that you can then build off of, because I think a lot of people don't know a lot of people who have stories of adoption or being in foster care. And I think it's great because even when I was listening, I was like, I haven't dedicated the time to like researching and investigating like all the different laws and the like legal side of it, but just the knowledge about the like adoption system. So it's been great just like from education and like well-rounded standpoint, and then also just getting to know you and other people um, and about their stories. So
Yeah. Awesome. Yeah, and getting to have your story on is also great. Like this show will be dropping on Mariah as well as my my show. So it's really cool to kind of, do this together and be interviewed instead of doing the interviewing. And yeah, it's been a really fun journey so far, and I'm excited I have a lot of people lined up, and I actually have two. I have that This is probably unprofessional, but I have other I have a couple of shows I've recorded that I just haven't dropped yet. So I'm very excited to have some more people, some more episodes dropping pretty soon.
Yes. Yeah, I do. Yeah, that's not unprofessional at all. It's smart. No, I would say the same thing as you record them beforehand. And I also just want to put it in there too, like you said like the inclusivity of using folks as a term. I love
Yeah.
that. And I appreciate that of just like it having it's ungendered and welcoming. I think that's
Yeah.
really cool. Yeah.
And it's just kind of cool. Like it's just like, what's up, folks?
Yeah. Yeah.
I start my podcast off kind of with like a jazzy beat. It's like, what's up, folks? Because
Yeah.
I really want it to just be like a place where somebody feels like they're sitting next to me at a coffee shop. I just want that level to be able to touch people at that level. I think is something that podcasts do that I love. I think there's a lot of entertainment that comes from that. There's a lot of learning that comes from it as well. And so the crossroads of those two things are my favorite part about podcasts.
That's so intentional. I love like that, like the jazzy feel, the music, everything behind that. It's great. And this has been so much fun. Thank you again for making the time out of your schedule to come and chat and learn more about me, tell me more about your story. It's been phenomenal.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's been great.
Thank you all for listening and dedicating some time to listen to these conversations and being an external part of them. I really hope that with each episode, maybe you can take away some new perspectives or ways to reflect on how what we talked about pertain to your own life, your own experiences, and your own goals. Be sure to follow Learn to Listen on your favorite social media channels: Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, YouTube. Also, please, 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 it would help me out so much if you could subscribe to the show on whatever platform that you're listening to Learn to Listen on.